promise, and every program holds great possibilities, and we want you to participate. We have a good thing here, and you know you don't want to keep a good thing to yourself. So now that you've started your parties, tagged and shared with friends, and encouraged them to do the same, are you ready? Great, because it's time for When Life Speaks. Life speaks. It speaks through struggles and success, through music and messages, the preconceived and the unexpected. Whether you are in the depths of the valley or in the midst of your mountaintop experience, everyone needs to be encouraged from time to time. Here we will share stories of strength, testimonies of triumph, verses of victory, observations, and information meant to touch the heart and uplift the soul, to keep you on your path of purpose with power and authority. This is Andrea L. Hines, and I'm your host for When Life Speaks here on the Streaming Inspirational Broadcast Network. I am glad you accepted the invitation to join us tonight. There is something in this broadcast just for you, and if it is going to be a blessing to your life, it will be a blessing to someone else as well. So, did you start your watch party? Did you tag and share someone you know and invite them to join? I certainly hope so, because now it's time to get ready to receive, so that when life speaks, you will speak life. Well, welcome, everybody. You have tuned in to When Life Speaks here on the Streaming Inspirational Broadcast Network and the Empowerment Radio. I am your host, Andrea L. Hines, and I want to thank you for being here this evening. I hope you enjoyed this past holiday weekend and got to take some time off. I know I took a little road trip and had a great time with friends, and I hope you did something relaxing and enjoyable as well. I want to dive right into the program tonight so that you can hear from a great guest who has a courageous testimony. Now, some of our guests at our recent anniversary celebration let us know they wish they could have heard the stories of strength and testimonies of triumph that were highlighted from our very first year on the air. So we rebroadcast Dr. Angela Rigsby's story last week from Surviving to Thriving about domestic violence. And I asked for your choice in doing another replay. And so tonight, that is what we are going to do. My guest is a facilitator and support coach for the Women's Support Psychosocial Support Group at Heart to Hand Ministry, and that's located in Largo, Maryland. She has earned her AA in psychology, Christian counseling, and her passion for coaching has intensified throughout the years, and as a result, she has been afforded the opportunity to coach and consult with individuals, artists, businesses, ministries, and organizations. She is an advocate for the needs of women in the HIV/AIDS community, and her name is Shante Spriggs. And her story, From Trauma to Triumph, dealing with the HIV/AIDS issue, and you wanted to hear her story. So, if you missed it the first time, here's your chance. Invite a friend, set up your watch party, because in less than a minute, you are going to hear the courageous testimony of Shante Spriggs. Stay tuned. very, very special guest, and I've been talking about this young lady coming on When Life Speaks for quite some time. She didn't even know it, but I was talking about her. So I am very, very happy to welcome her. Her name is Shante Spriggs. I've given you a little bit about her background, but you know on When Life Speaks, I always like for my guests to tell you a little bit about their personal bio and things like that. So, Shante, how are you doing this evening?
I am doing great. I'm doing refreshed. It's the top of the new year. I'm ready to jump into my goals that I have set forth for this year. We've had a little bit of snow here, so it's a little gloomy, but the sun is out, so I'm just ready for the spring to hit. So I'm just excited. How are you doing today?
I am great. I'm excited as well, and I've just been looking forward to you being able to share part of your journey with our listeners. So, listeners, you know what to do. You send up some hearts and you send up some likes right now so that Shante knows that she is loved and that she is welcomed. So, Shante, tell us a little bit about your background. Like, where are you from? Tell us a little bit about where you were educated, things like that. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm originally from Washington, D.C. I had a couple of stops here and there, but I'm originally from Northeast D.C., so anyone from Northeast D.C., go ahead and give a little heart, whoop, 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 from the Trinidad Avenue area. I actually went to Catholic school first. I went to Holy Name, and then I went to St. Francis de Sales. And then I had a little time period where I went to North Carolina for a bit, and then I came back to D.C. and actually finished my high school years at Paul Laurence Dunbar. So anyone that went to Dunbar, go ahead and give me some hearts there. And so then afterwards, I actually did a little bit of business school and said, hey, this is not for me. And I entered into my career that I thought was going to be my career, and that was with the Postal Service. So I was there for about 8 years, and then life took a shift, and then I landed in North Carolina. So that was kind of like an interesting twist to my life.
And Shante, you may not know it or may not remember it, but I was also born and raised in D.C. on the northwest side.
Yeah.
And went to McKinley Technical High School there, and also worked in the Postal Service. So we had a little more in
that part I didn't know.
Yes, I certainly did. But I know that there was a day in church, and pastor announced that there was someone who wanted to give a testimony. And I remember you walking up, and I remember you just sharing your heart and with transparency, talking about what must have been a very difficult part of your journey. And I'm not going to belabor this at all, because I really want you to share with the listeners not just that story, but what it was like for you to even have courage enough to give that testimony. So I'm giving space to you, and the platform is yours to just speak as you choose.
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for the opportunity again, and also I would like to thank Pastor Garvey for that opportunity that particular day. That day changed my life, and I would have to say that's pretty much where my advocacy work began. So during that time in my life, I thought my life was what I would say thriving. Like I said, my life took a shift from the Postal Service. I was actually in a whole different career when I came to North Carolina. I had started with a financial institution, and my career was definitely thriving. I was being promoted, and I was kind of living, as they say, their best life. I was married at the time, and my children were in a good place. They're very gifted and talented, as you know, and but at that particular time, life kind of hit me just like a freight train hit me, and everything was just shattered at that point. And I was left with the "Are you serious?" moment. And what had taken place at that point was I was – do you mind if I kind of share, like, those steps that I went through?
Okay. Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Okay. So what had happened was I was planning for a conference that I normally had, because at that time I was I was pretty much active in ministry, and I was doing pretty much evangelistic ministry where I was having a conference yearly. And this particular time I was planning for my conference, and I remember during one of our convocation times, the Lord had spoke to me and asked me during the conference, he said, put a pause on your conference, and I need to let you know who's around you. And so I was thinking that it was like, oh, I got to have some hateration or something around me. And he said, the next time that you do this, I want to endorse it. And so I was thinking, okay, yes, God, I hear you, because sometimes when he speaks, certain things that he speaks, clearly this is the voice of the Lord. So I knew then, so I put everything on a halt. I put my speakers, let them keep their honorariums, the deposits, put my the psalmists I had, the venues. I let everyone keep their money, and I just said, hey, I have to pause. And so in the next 2 weeks, everything kind of took a turn. And so I ran into a preacher, friend of mine, who I hadn't seen in years. And I used to be one of his administrators when he was an evangelist, but now he was a pastor in one of the fastest growing churches in Lynchburg, Virginia. And we used to always joke about how, okay, you're out here being an evangelist to these college students when you know you're a pastor. And so now he's a pastor. And so I ran into him, and he said, hey, Spriggs, when are you going to come visit my church? And I said, you know what, it's been years. I'm going to actually come the next time you have an event. And so lo and behold, the next time he was having an event was a women's conference, and the time frame was the same time that I was supposed to have my conference. And so I said, well, hey, this is perfect. I said, this is perfect timing. I don't even have to take off because I just canceled an event, but I never put my time back in at work. My daughter and I will come down and spend some time with you and come to the conference. So fast forward, I go to the conference. That Saturday, he had kind of dedicated time to catch up with me and my daughter because we're kind of like family. And I went to the morning session, and while he was counseling someone, he had told me to take a look around the church, and they were doing different things like, health bazaars, and they had beauty bazaars. People were doing nails and things of that nature, and they were doing screenings for cervical cancer and HIV. And so because I'm kind of familiar with his congregation through the years of him pastoring, even when he was evangelizing, I always talked to his youth. And so when they were talking about HIV, some of them were a little reluctant in getting tested. And so I was trying to get them to go ahead and get tested. And I said, hey, this is something I do anyway. And they were saying, well, you're married. Why do you do this? I said, well, I get tested for HIV every year. I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm from an area where it's prevalent. This is something that we do anyway. And so one of the young ladies had asked, well, if we sign up for it, will you do it with us, Ms. Shante? And I said, sure, of course. I don't mind. And so I just did it so they can sign up. So I went in to get tested, and I'm talking to the nurse there, and I'll never forget her name, Miss Rhonda. And I'm talking to her, and she said, well, we can get the results back in 15 minutes. And I was amazed because typically when I go to my doctor, it's about a week. And I said, we get the results back in 15 minutes? This is what you really call rapid. So I was fascinated at the way technology was. And so I stepped back out, and then I'm talking to the young ladies, and then she called me back in, and I'm just ready for her to give me my results. And she said, hey, we're going to have to test you again. And I looked at her, and I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, your test came back picking up HIV antibodies. And I said, what does that mean? She said, well, maybe we had a bad batch, so we want to test you again. And so I could tell she looked a little apprehensive, and so I said, well, what we're going to do, and it was so funny because I switched roles as if I was the narrator or the nurse. I said, well, what we're going to do is because I said, I have about 6 or 7 young ladies out there that we don't know what their diagnosis may be. If I leave out of here in tears or broken, they're going to follow suit. So I need to put my game face on, and I still, when I look back at that, I don't even know how I had the strength or the fortitude or even the instructions or manual to do that because this had never been done. And I said, I'm going to go out of here. You don't need to prick my finger. I said, prick my finger, but don't put a Band-Aid on it, because if I walk out of here with a Band-Aid on another finger, somebody's going to recognize that. My daughter, for one, is very intuitive. She's going to recognize that. So I'm going to walk out of here like nothing, and I'm going to go to the pastor's study, and you come there and then give me my results of the second test. So sure enough, I walked out the office, and I just started jumping up and praising God like I'm good. I was like, whoo, 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 I'm good, hallelujah, and just started shouting and stuff. And I said, where's the study at? Because the church was a big church, and so I had someone lead me there, and it was less than probably like 5 minutes, but it seemed like it took me an hour to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, when I got there, he was still counseling, and so he said, Spriggs, come on in here, and he wanted me to put on that ministerial hat or that counselor hat, and we just started talking, and I'm sitting there like, no, I don't want to do this right now. I have an issue. But we were still talking to the young lady there, and then at that particular time, the nurse came up, Miss Rhonda came in, and I think I made up something like, hey, I want to do this type of program in Greensboro, and we just want to kind of brainstorm with you, and so we excused the young lady out, and then when we closed the door, that's when I told my pastor friend, I said, hey, I think she's getting ready to tell you that I'm HIV positive. And I remember him just buckling, and he was like, no, Spriggs, not you. And from that day, my life changed and was never the same from that moment.
Shante, let me ask you something. When you got that diagnosis, because there's so many myths and suppositions and everything surrounding AIDS and HIV, what was your first thought, the very first thought that you had when you heard that diagnosis that day?
My first thought was, I'm about to die. And at that time, my marriage, I was married at the time. I'm divorced now, but I had already went through some challenges, and I was trying to work through that in my marriage. And I stayed through those challenges, and I remember having a real quick conversation with God and saying I stayed just to die, because that was the first thing that I was thinking was like, I'm going to die. So I was like, I stayed, and I tried to work it out only for the end result to be for me to die. This was the result. I'm going to die after staying. That was what I first thought.
And when you were, how long was it, and actually it's a two-part question that I have when I listen to you talk, how long was it before you actually told anyone, and between the time that you had found out and the time that you made that testimony at church? What was the time frame?
Let me see. That was September 2010, and I believe that may have been around MLK. So we're coming near MLK now. How interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, didn't even realize that. So that was a couple of months. It may have been, I think, the following year, the year after. It took me about a year. So probably a year. My daughter was the first person I told.
What was her reaction?
I remember my pastor friend, he actually said, don't worry about her, because he had the rest of the young ladies kind of tend to her, and he got me out the church and got me away. And so we went to go meet her later, and I remember us being in the car because there was a night service, and so we was riding back to our hotel, and I said, well, you're probably wondering what's going on. And I said, and I was crying, and I said, I just need to tell you that I took a test, and I'm HIV positive. And I remember she was looking out the window the whole time, and she kept looking out the window, and I think she was no more than probably like 14 or 12 then. I think she was 14. And she said, okay. Never changed her reaction, but she did something that was very, like, it changed my life when we got back to the hotel. When we got back to the hotel, I just laid on the bed, and I was just so exhausted. And she said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm just laying down. She said, well, you have about an hour. I said, an hour? She said, yeah, because I know you're upset and you're sad. She said, but you came down here for a reason and for this conference, and that's what we're going to do. You're not going to let this stop you. So go ahead and take your nap or do whatever you have to do in an hour. But in an hour, I'm getting you up if I have to help you get ready, and we're going back to night service.
Wow.
And from that moment, she's been that person that always helps me snap back when I get stuck in that moment.
Wow. And I know how difficult that is. I mean, we talk about testimonies of triumph and here at When Life Speaks and all of the things that you go through, because when you have those kinds of testimonies and those kinds of circumstances and life speaks in you in those kinds of ways, it is very hard, and at least I found it hard. I remember when I got my cancer diagnosis, which is low on the totem pole by comparison, but still traumatic.
Wow.
And the first person that I had to tell was my daughter. And
wow.
Yeah, and we have to remember that in these moments of transparency, we take the family with us. You know what I mean? It's not just us. When you tell your story, it's not just your story, it's her story as well. So we have to be mindful about when we release and how we release and who we release it to. So my next question for you is, what made you decide to give that testimony at church of all places, because that's the toughest audience sometimes to be transparent with. So what led you to do it at the time that you did it?
Well, and it was kind of like where I saw a lack, and I always go by, the phrase or the statement that Gandhi says, be the change that you want to see. And one of the things, when I finally picked myself up off the floor and stopped dealing with depression and to start to take charge of the situation and seek help, everywhere I went was community-based. And there wasn't a lot of resources that was Christian-based or had that Christian foundation, not where I resided. If I came back to probably the Washington, D.C. area, because it's more prevalent here, then I would have found that. But at that time in Greensboro, it was more community-based. And even though it was great resources, I still needed that spiritual foundation to help me deal with this and balance it. And so I was going to therapists, I was going to support groups, but I didn't find anything in the church. And I said, well, when I go to church, I often hear things where people openly talk about cancer, and people openly talk about molestation, they talk about rape, or they talk about these things, but I'm not hearing nothing about this. And I felt so much shame around it. And I said, but why should I feel ashamed? And then I thought, if I was feeling this way, there had to be other people that was feeling this way as well. And I said, the only way that we're going to be able to break the stigma that's associated with this is somebody has to come out the cave or come out the box or come out of wherever and say, hey, this is me. And then I figured if I tell my story, then there'll be other people that come forth with their story, and it won't be that abnormal. And what was seen once abnormal will now be normal. And there'll always still be a little stigma there, but it won't be as prevalent as it was before.
Got you.
And so that's what made me come out.
Well, Shante, we're going to take a break and a breath right here for just a minute. And listeners, I just want you to hang in there, listen to the music, and we will be right back. Welcome back, everyone. This is Andrea L. Hines, your host of When Life Speaks, and we have been having just an awesome discussion this evening with Shante Spriggs. And Shante has just begun telling us her story, because I know that there is great depth and far more than we can cover on When Life Speaks in the evening. But she's just been very courageous about dealing with probably what some would say is the worst diagnosis that anybody could get, just hitting her from the blue, and that was being diagnosed with AIDS. And Shante, I want you to continue, because we were talking about, when we closed out the other segment, about breaking the stigma. And there had been, and I believe there still is, a stigma surrounding HIV, surrounding AIDS. And if you could tell us the difference between the two, or if there is a difference, that may be helpful to some of our listeners who may not be aware. But there was at one time an awful lot of talk about AIDS, and you very seldom hear it now. You don't hear as much about it. I'm not sure whether that's the strides that have been made. I don't know whether that is just people not being willing to come forth. I'm not sure, and you can shed some insight on that with us, if you will. But I really want you to talk about your advocacy and the kinds of things that you're doing and organizations that you may be working with to help to break that stigma, so that people who need to have that voice are more comfortable in having it. Because this, I know this is helping somebody out there, if not for them personally, as they share this broadcast with someone that they may know. I know there is some encouragement and information that you can share with them. So feel free, go right ahead. Let's talk about breaking that stigma and some advocacy things that you've got going on.
Absolutely. First, I'll start off with the difference with HIV and AIDS. So HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus, which is the virus that causes the HIV infection. Now, AIDS stands for acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. AIDS is what we consider the most advanced stage of HIV infection. So just to kind of break that down, HIV attacks and destroys the infection-fighting, what we call CD4 cells of the immune system. So typically, if your CD4 count falls below 250 or 200, they consider you to be at AIDS level. But most people, when they first find out, are typically at 500 to 700 CD4 count. But the thing is, you want to always make sure that your CD4 count is high. So right now, I see a lot of individuals in my support group, they're trying to get their numbers up to like 1,000. You want your viral load to be low. That means viral load means as much of the HIV virus that's in your system. The key thing is you want your viral load to be undetected. Right now, the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control, has basically put out a statement that people with HIV who take their HIV medicine as prescribed and can keep their status as undetectable, they have no risk for transmitting the HIV virus to someone who's negative.
Oh,
so
okay.
As long as that's been released, I think, for like the last year or two now. So the thing is to keep your viral load undetectable, and you want to keep your CD4 count high. Really, the only difference between HIV and AIDS is your CD4 count. So if your CD4 count goes below 250 or 200, then that's when they consider you to be at AIDS level. And that's typically when your body can't fight off certain cancers or infections, so you start seeing those things, your organs start shutting down those things. But I've seen and have been able to support people that's had their CD4 count at 25, and now they're at like 700 or 800, and they're living well and undetectable. So I've seen like some miracles take place.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so those are things that I've seen with my advocacy hat. So you mentioned that, and I have to say, things kind of, like I said, got started when I first spoke out at church that particular Sunday, and then I had the opportunity to speak at Elon University on AIDS. At World AIDS Day, I actually got a call from, there was a support group I was attending, and I was the only female in that support group, so they gave me the opportunity to come speak at Elon University before I left North Carolina, and so that was a great opportunity. And then at that particular time, my job transferred me back to the D.C. area. And when I moved back to Maryland, I said, it has to be something here. I mean, this is the nation's capital. And one night I was just Googling. And that's one thing I tell people. If you want to get out there, you know, it has to be a hunger. You know, it's so much on the internet. Go for it. Look for it. And that's what I did. I started Googling. I said, it has to be something out here. And so I just started doing a search for HIV and AIDS. And so I found something called AIDS United or AIDS Watch. And so AIDS Watch, this event changed my life. So this is the nation's largest annual constituent-based national HIV/AIDS advocacy event. So what this is, AIDS Watch brings together hundreds of people, I'm talking about from different states, of people living with HIV and their allies to meet with members of Congress. And what they do is they educate them about the important issues at stake for people living with HIV in the U.S. So this particular time, I just thought when I registered for it, and I saw that the registration was free, I said, oh, this is free? Oh, definitely. Sign me up. And what you do is you just go one day, and it's this big old conference, and they have people that are constituents from Maryland, constituents from, you know, from Illinois, different places, and then they say that these are the current legislative bills that we're trying to fight for. And I remember going to my table for Maryland, and they said, okay, give us your story in 2 to 3 minutes. And someone gave their story. Then they pointed at me, and they said, okay, give us your story. And I gave my story, and they said, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, at the time I said, well, I'm a facilitator for a financial institution. They said, okay, here, take this folder, learn this, study it, and tomorrow you'll be one of the representatives to go speak to Congress. And I said, huh? What? And literally my life changed. And so I was like one of the lead focals for having to go be the spokesperson representing Maryland, because this is what I'm used to speaking in meetings. I'm used to facilitating, but I had no idea that training was going to set me up for advocacy work. And that's why I said all things do work together. But everything just started connecting. And so the next day, I had an opportunity to actually meet one of the congressmen in the hallway that they said they never get an opportunity to speak with. And I walked up to him like I knew him, and I just said something to him, and we was able to get a meeting on the spot. And from there I made connections, and then I was able to get plugged into the Baltimore Planning Committee. And the Baltimore Planning Committee, these are basically where people, there's a certain percentage of the board where there's people living with HIV, and then there's people that's not living with HIV. But this is where the money comes in to that particular state. And we decide where we want the money to go to, whether we want money to go to mental resources, or we want money to go to more nutritional programs for people with HIV. We get to decide, people that's living with HIV. I didn't even know these type of things were out there. So I strongly encourage people that, you know, if you're living with HIV, get involved, because the more advocacy work that you do, there's a sense of empowerment that comes across. And then with me getting more empowered, I start speaking out more about it, and then opportunities just start opening up. And then that's when I start getting into other things. And now I'm facilitating, and the list just goes on and on. National Minority AIDS Council, I do things with them. So it's just so much. The advocacy hat is that's my main hat I wear. So the thing that turned out to be the worst really has opened so many doors for me, and it's no longer the worst. It's one of the best things that happened to me. Seriously.
Mhm. Mhm. I know that for so long, when the AIDS epidemic first began and people started talking about it, it was just a death sentence, and there seemed to be no hope. And now, you know, I'm listening to you talking about this advocacy and all of the things that are available to people, and all of the things that can be done so that people can thrive and can live a best life and can, you know, enjoy the life that they were intended to enjoy in spite of. And I just think that's amazing. But I do want to ask you one question with your journey, particularly in the beginning. What did you find to be the most challenging part of it?
I think the most challenging part, and this is still a challenge to me now, like for instance, I currently am the facilitator for a support group for Heart to Hand. That's a nonprofit in Largo, Maryland, and I love them. They're spoken as a heart that cares with hands to help. I love them, and dealing with them or supporting and partnering with my women, because we're in this together. That's never a challenge. Or dealing with the community, it's never a challenge. I find more of a challenge or facing stigma or discriminatory statements with dealing with my inner circle. And I say that because sometimes I've been on conversations where, and I'm just being transparent, I sometimes brace myself, or I put on a shield, or I make sure I have my bulletproof vest on when I know I have to speak in front of an audience or in the community, or I know I have to go face this constituent. I'm ready for that, and it doesn't come. But I'm not ready for when I'm on the phone with someone and they say, hey, yeah, such and such was just involved with such and such, and I hope they was protected because there's no telling what she has. Well, do you know who's on the other end of this phone? And you get that nudge in your stomach, and oftentimes I used to didn't say anything. I'm just recently learning to speak up. Or sometimes I face the challenge even with my family members, and I'm trying to pull them along with me now because I'm always, hey, and on a cloud or 100. That sometimes they don't understand when I am down or when I'm not good or when I'm sick, because they've even made a statement to me that sometimes we forget that you even have that. This is something I face every day. But because I face it in a positive way, that doesn't mean that you can't occasionally ask, how am I doing with it? And just recently I had something where a statement was made to me, but this is where I finally said, no, I have to change this. I have to address it. Someone made a statement to me, and they didn't mean any harm, but they said, hey, if I was in a particular relationship, and this person moved on, and we're good friends, and I was happy for them because I believe that all relationships don't have to end in war, and I was happy for them, and they had mentioned that they was afraid to even kind of move on in a sense, because they had thought at one particular time the statement was made to me that they felt as though people would consider them to be tainted because I was tainted. And that was the exact words. And I said, what did you say? And they said, I thought that they thought I would be tainted because you was tainted. And I sat on that for about a week. And finally I had to make a call and said, we need to have a conversation. And I had to address, and first I looked up the word tainted, and I looked and it said contaminated, and when I addressed it, that person didn't mean it that way, but that's what I realized I have to start doing every time that it's that situation or it's that phone conversation. I have to let people know that, hey, this is something that's discriminatory towards us. This is an act of stigma. Stigma is basically your belief, but the minute that they act on it or they say something, that's discriminatory. And this is what you just did. People don't know what they don't know. So I'm now taking those moments of where I would just be like, ouch, or emotional, and I'm turning them into teachable moments. Let me educate you on this. That right there, that's offensive. And that's the way I'm continuing to break the stigma.
And I think that is wonderful, because just because of what you said, we don't know what we don't know. And it is one thing for someone to make that kind of comment intentionally, and it's another to not understand the hurt that you cause to people that you love because you just aren't aware. You just aren't aware of how it sounds and what to do. So I am grateful, and I am just, that is so encouraging, because it's sometimes it's like I talk to people when they're talking about grief, and nobody can tell you how to grieve, and nobody really understands unless they're in that place. And I remember saying to a friend of mine, tell me how to help you, because I don't know. I want to be there for you, but I may want to be there for you on a day you don't want me to be there for you.
That's good.
So what do I do as a friend? What do I do as a loved one? So I just, for you to just say that to us and just remind us that there are just some things that you shouldn't say. They're just some words that you shouldn't use. And it's not because you mean to be offensive, and it's not because you mean to be hurtful, but it's because sometimes we just don't know what to say. So I just, even for that bit of education tonight, so that when we do speak with people that we know and that we love, and even when you don't know, because that's where the little book comes from, and I hope maybe before the show is over I'll have time to read it again tonight. If you only knew my story, and sometimes we don't get to know. We don't always get to know the story. But I am so grateful for you taking the time to share your story with us tonight here at When Life Speaks. I know that you have something coming up. You have a book coming up, and I'm not going to say much about it right now. I want my listeners to know that you will be back as we get closer to the spring and closer to that release. I'm going to have you come back and talk about the book and just continue to educate us and keep us moving in the direction of love, which is what we all want to do all the time. But before we close, Shantae, is there a particular scripture or word in the Word that kind of kept you through that or that period, or continues to minister to you now? Because, like you said, it's an everyday battle. It doesn't go away. You haven't put it in a box and put it in the corner of the closet. It is still something that you have to deal with all of the time. So is there a word that just ministers to you?
Yeah, I would have to say, because one of the things I always look at is even with a positive diagnosis, there's still a way for you to remain positive and productive, and that was my thing. I wanted to always make sure I was productive, and I couldn't do that without focusing on Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the thoughts that or the plans that I have for you, or, the King James Version said, the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. But what I love is the Message version of it says, I know what I'm doing. I have it all planned out. And the thing is, plans to take care of you and to not abandon you, and plans to give you the future you hope for. And so when I looked at that, I was like, so you mean that you're not going to abandon me? Because lots of times in this walk, you can kind of feel like, especially with HIV, that you're isolated, or, people don't understand dealing with the stigmas. So I constantly look at, what, God, you have an expected end for it in me, meaning that you have some type of expectations. You have some goals for me. You already set this in place. So you know what? I just have to walk this out. I just got to walk this out because it's going to all work together. So that's been a thing that I've constantly looked at, Jeremiah 29:11, and it's gotten me through.
I tell you what, that if nothing encourages you like that Message Bible, I don't know what it is. But that interpretation it is always just what we need, Well, Shantae, I'm sorry our time is up, because I could talk to you probably for another hour.
Likewise.
But we have to come to a close, and I thank you so much. I thank you so much, because it is just I don't even know how to put it, but to be able to speak with and to difficult issues with a level of transparency, I just want to tell you that I thank you for trusting me with your story. And I'm so glad that we had this time on When Life Speaks, and I look forward to you coming on again and sharing more about your journey. That sound good?
That sounds great. Thanks for the opportunity. And thank you all, everyone, for listening and being a part of my story.
Well, God bless you. And listeners, you hold on. We will be right back before we close out the show this evening. So stay tuned. Ever had a situation when you were really going through and you realized there was no one you could tell your story to? You just wanted to scream and say, if you only knew, I bet you wouldn't dare respond to me the way you do. I can tell the way you look at me, you've made up in your mind what you think is going on, never asking if I'm fine. Never taking time to see if something might be wrong or stopping to encourage me. Instead, you move along. If you only knew my story, would you still judge my praise? Or question why I turn my eyes toward heaven in a daze? If you only knew what I had been through, would you still think I was fake? Or think my tears were insincere because I've found a way to make the best of every situation and put a smile upon my face because I choose to trust in God whom I can't even trace? Would it really make a difference if I told you of my past, or would it be fuel for someone to use to then put me on blast, telling all my business, pretending you want what's best, but you're just spreading gossip disguised as a prayer request? You can tell yourself, if you had known the place that I was in, you would have shown compassion and tried to be my friend. Do you really think that's what God wants? For us to pick and choose whom we think deserves his love, whom he can or cannot use? You shouldn't have to know anyone's story or delve into their past to treat them with sincerity, for Christ's love will outlast whatever people think and feel or see as wrong or right. What matters is what God sees and what's pleasing in his sight. Next time you encounter people who don't look like you, who don't do or say or act, in fact, the same way that you do, don't make any assumptions or expect their life in great detail. Just release an outpouring of God's love, and then let his love prevail. Well, that's it for this evening. Thank you for joining me, everyone, and thank you for Shantae Spriggs, who was the inspiration behind that little pocketbook I just read, If You Only Knew My Story. I thank each of you listeners for being here. We've got some special things coming up next month, the month of June. We're going to be talking to the men, lifting them up in our lives in prayer, and just seeing what they've got on their minds. So keep checking Facebook to see how you can be a part of the broadcast. Come back next week at 7 p.m. and receive what you need so that when life speaks, you'll speak life. Good night, everybody.
When Life Speaks was produced by Film Studios for the SIBN Network.